Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the long Memorial Day weekend and got to do some fun things. As I mentioned, this past week, I was in Paris presenting research at a conference and thought I'd share a couple photos of the experience. It was really interesting. The conference, this is just the conference venue. It was a little hotel kind of in downtown Paris. There were some cool presentations. The obligatory Eiffel Tower photo. We got to do it was a little tour where there was like kind of like a little buggy that a guy took us around that went to some of the big landmarks in Paris, like this and the major museum and a couple other things. So that was a lot of fun. And then we also went to the Montmartre neighborhood, which had a really large hill, the highest viewpoint in the city, where you could see just the surrounding old buildings in downtown. It was a whole lot of fun and great to be at that conference. And it is good to be back. We flew back on Tuesday, and I drove back to La Grande from Salt Lake City last night. So good to be home and good to be here for our last day of class. So welcome back. I hope that you're doing well as we get into the final week and as we gear up to wrap up for the course. Grant was asking about classes that I'll be teaching. So I will not be teaching in the summer, but I will be teaching both interpersonal communication in the fall, 2 sections face-to-face, and a new course that is communication and social movements. If you're interested and want to see a syllabus, just let me know. I'm happy to send that along. We'll be talking about social change and related issues, and it should be able to fulfill DPD credits. So if that's something you're interested in, I definitely recommend checking that out. So last class, we focused on health and science communication as it related to gender, right? There were 3 different readings that we checked out related to that topic. Again, helping us to understand, for example, that the way that we view masculinity and how that's defined can oftentimes mean that men might be less willing or more reluctant to seek care, that oftentimes women experience a variety of disparities in healthcare, and that for a variety of sexual and gender minorities, that the experiences of advocating and receiving care are made a lot more challenging. So these are important ways to think about and to analyze issues of gender in healthcare. I've also posted the final quiz for the course that I'm extending out to the 11th. That quiz will cover some of those readings that we talked about before the break, and also the final set of readings that we'll be looking at a little bit more for today. So we'll be doing that in just a little bit. We'll be understanding disability and disability's role in healthcare, how different models of disability can impact issues of health, and then we'll be doing a final overall course wrap-up. And this is important because we kind of talked about and alluded to disability at a lot of different points in the quarter. When we think about health and science, what does it mean to be healthy? What is a healthy body or healthy mind? Or what does it mean across different cultures to experience health? One of the first examples we talked about is this idea that under a deficit or very medical model of disability, something like deafness is seen as an impediment or detriment to one's health. Whereas a lot of folks who are deaf might push back and say, deafness is a part of my identity and a part of my culture and essential to who I am, right? Disability is something we see a lot discussed in media. It's estimated that about 20% of Americans have a disability in a long-term context, whether it's a very visible disability that impacts things such as mobility, or whether it's an invisible or intermittently visible disability, right? So a lot of conditions that might be developmental or cognitive are not necessarily things that we see. And for people with disabilities, oftentimes they are assumed to be able-bodied on that basis too. right? So that's an important consideration as well. And as prominent disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson tells us, just about all of us will experience disability at some point in our lives, whether that means that we have experienced a major injury or we've gotten sick, right? Those experiences will mean that we will feel those effects and relate to disability in a personal and kind of proximal way. That health and science are very concerned with what disability is and how to support and consider disability more broadly in healthcare. So this will be helpful for us as we're thinking about, regardless of whether or not we are pursuing healthcare and a career in our lives, the ways in which we communicate about and talk about this issue. So just as a reminder, June 11th is the deadline to turn in that final paper for the course. That is the Health Science Campaign essay. Again, I've talked about last week the rubric and the expectations for that assignment, but pick a campaign that's interesting to you and focus on that campaign to understand the ways that communication is happening. Remember to also turn in the extra credit opportunity if you are planning to do that extra 20 points. And if you have missed more than 3 classes, please also make sure to turn in any remaining makeup assignments so that we can get you credit for those days as well. So before we dive into the new stuff for today, I do want to make a note, since this is our last class meeting, about the instructor course evaluations. So you should have received an email a few days ago that's asking you to complete those evaluations on Canvas. Those are super helpful, especially since this is my first time teaching this course at EOU. It's useful for me to know what worked well, some of the things that I can do to adjust it for the future. So if you haven't already had the chance to complete that evaluation, I'm going to give you a block of time to do so. You should be able to do so on your device. I would just encourage, if it's not something you can easily access, just to do a search for evaluation in your inbox, and that result should show up. So take some time to complete that evaluation if you haven't already done so. If you have, then you're welcome to work on an evaluation for another course, or take a bit of time to start to brainstorm and think about that campaign essay for this class. I know me standing here while you're working on that evaluation could be a little bit silly and seem a little bit weird. So what I will do is step out for about 10 minutes or so, give you some time to work on and complete those evaluations from your device. And then after that, we will pick up where we left off and explore this week's topic on disability in a little bit more detail. So I will be back at about 2:20 or so. Please take the time to complete these if you haven't already. And we will pick up again in just a little bit. Is there anybody who's still working on the form and needs another minute? Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to do that. And if you did not have the chance, I encourage you to do so after class. So thank you. And let's go ahead and get into our new content for the last day today. So one of the key questions here is when we think about health and science and the way that disability is communicated within that, defining and analyzing what disability is and therefore what disability means. And when we think about disability, we've talked about the ways in which it's not necessarily visible, that it covers a variety of elements. But when we think about how it's represented, think about, for instance, a placard or a sign to indicate accessible parking. It's a person in a wheelchair, right? Or when we think about how disability is visually shown, like in a cast of a TV show or film, oftentimes disability is marked in a very visible or clear way. I think there's been a lot of progress and representation of a more complex way of thinking about disability, but oftentimes it has this very kind of visual focus. When we think about disability as well, I think it's important for us to contrast the two different models of disability. You've taken my listening course, we talked about that a little bit, but just to give you a sense of these two contrasting approaches and the assumptions that they bring with them, the two major models of disability that are generally used are what is known as the medical model of disability, or the kind of biomedical approach, and the social model of disability. I should add that there are a couple variations and changes that have happened since then. For example, some people, such as disability activist Allison Paper, has put forth a political relational model. So there's different ways of thinking outside of these two, but I think understanding the evolution of those two is a good way of thinking about how disability has at times been understood very differently by patients versus health providers versus advocates, activists, and so on, right? The medical model of disability suggests that there is an ideal body, right? That there is a perfect body or a perfect way of being. And as a result, that the impairments or experiences of disabilities are problems that need to be solved or issues that need to be fixed, right? That impairments and illness impose difficulties, but they are seen as the main problem under the medical model, right? That disability is caused by the individual who's impaired and therefore experiences the problem. And from a medical perspective, there is a very large emphasis on curing or removing whatever is seen as the source of the problem. You know, whether it's something such as a medical cure or treatment, whether it's providing somebody with, you know, a substitute for a limb that has been missing or something similar, right? This model really views the ideal healthy body, the ideal way of being, and therefore individuals who do not meet that standard have a problem that needs to be fixed or needs to be addressed, right? And that's the model that oftentimes a lot of people are taught in medical school. A lot of professionals take on the deficit medical approach that suggests there's a problem, there's an issue, we need to fix this, we need to solve or cure the problem. We think about this as it relates to deaf culture and identity. Something like a cochlear implant is seen as potentially threatening to members of the deaf community who don't want that and see themselves as able to communicate just fine as is. The medical model says, you're deaf, that's a problem, here's something to fix. The social model of disability does not say that disability is not felt individually, right? Or that we don't have challenges or issues. We still have an experience impairment, right? If you're sick, if you're running a fever, if you're not able to get around easily, right? If you experience dizziness or low blood pressure, like that experience is something that you still feel and you still encounter that impairment. But that's different from what disability is, right? Under the social model, disability says, disability is about the relationship between impairment and society, right? So if somebody is feeling lack of access to resources and lack of full participation on an issue or topic, that inability to participate or disability is what they experience, right? So for example, yes, somebody might experience impairment as it relates to using a wheelchair, but disability is created by society if there isn't access to an elevator or ramp that allows them to safely enter a building, right? So the social model of disability is examining the barriers and issues that are causing somebody to feel excluded and unable to fully participate on an issue, right? And this is important as we think about health communication and we think about disparities, right? Because if we've identified the importance of patient-centered care in a holistic medicine, if we only focus on the medical model and only focus on curing or fixing the problem, we're not addressing the social factors that impact somebody's participation and inclusion. So, for instance, yes, a doctor could diagnose and identify somebody as having a significant disability that impacts their motor functions, but if society is not built to be accessible to that person, for example, if space doesn't allow for accessible parking to get where they need to go, then that diagnosis and that medical support only goes so far, right? We've talked a little bit about some of the history and context surrounding accessibility. One of the biggest things that we saw was the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, right, which allowed reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. That is, an employer who finds out that you have a disability through disclosure has to provide reasonable accommodation, whether it's providing more accessible access to a commute, whether it's making adjustments in material that's being provided, and so on, right? So there are a lot of efforts that are designed to promote accessibility through the ADA. But as we've talked about, there are also loopholes. For example, if a job ever says in the description you have to lift at least 30 pounds, you never actually have to lift 30 pounds in the job. That is oftentimes used to legally allow folks with disabilities to be unqualified for the job. So again, the social model is moving away from the idea that disability is purely understood in a medical problem, because if it's treated in a purely medical way, right, then the person is the problem, not necessarily the disabling barriers or factors that inhibit their ability to fully participate and be included. I have a short video that gets into some of the ways of thinking about these two contrasting models of disability in a little bit more detail. This will help us to kind of contrast those two approaches.
The medical and social models of disability. There are a number of models of disability which have been defined over the last few years. The two most frequently mentioned are the medical model and the social model. First, let's look at the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability views disability as a problem that belongs to the disabled individual. It is not seen as an issue to concern anyone other than the individual affected. For example, if a wheelchair-using student is unable to get into a building because of some steps, the medical model would suggest that this is because of the wheelchair rather than the steps. This medical model approach is based on the belief that difficulties associated with disability are the responsibility of the disabled person, and that the disabled person should adapt to fit into society. The main focus in this model is on the disability, not the person. Now let's look at the social model of disability. The social model of disability, on the other hand, would see the steps as the disabling barrier. This model suggests that it's society that disables people. The model suggests that if a person has a physical, sensory, or learning impairment, the disability only occurs when an individual is excluded because of that impairment. In other words, if barriers are removed, these people will become alienated, but their impairment hasn't changed. Instead of looking at the disability, the social model looks at the person and suggests that a lot can be done to reduce and ultimately remove some of the disabling barriers. And that this is the task and responsibility of society rather than the disabled person. In the social model, thought is given to how disabled people can participate in activities on an equal footing to others. Certain adjustments are made to ensure that disabled people are not excluded. An important principle in the social model is that the individual is the expert on their requirements, and that this should be respected regardless of whether the disability is obvious or not.
So a couple additional ideas that I think that this piece brings to the table that are useful. First of all is this question of responsibility, right? If the medical model assumes that the individual is responsible for fixing or addressing the issue, right? You're in a wheelchair, you can't get up the steps, you need to fix the fact that you're in a wheelchair and you can't walk, right? That, of course, is a big contributing factor to inequalities and disparities in healthcare. It assumes that through responsibility, people have the power or ability to address that issue. And the social model of disability instead places responsibility on society to promote things like accessibility. For example, we've seen more kind of virtual and remote meetings that include ASL interpreters and use that to promote accessibility. And then the other question here is that of expertise. Under the medical model, there's an assumption that the doctor is the expert, that the doctor can identify, diagnose, and cure an individual, whereas the social model assumes that the person with a disability is the expert, that they know their own body and their own experiences and can speak to those with expertise. So we can think about the kind of doctor-centric versus patient-centric model as kind of lining up and paralleling these two approaches pretty well. So in this way, disability is a relationship, right? That it examines the impairment that individuals might encounter, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional, and societal barriers that impact accessibility. If somebody is dyslexic, yes, they experience that in a sensory way, but there are also ways that society, through the use of text, writing, and so on, could make things a little bit more accessible. In other words, when we think about issues that impact health, disability understood in this way is useful to us. Another thing that I think is important, right, and I've touched a little bit on this before, is to understand the distinction between identity and person-first language, right? That's a central idea in communication, and also something you might encounter if you find yourself involved in health fields or communication, public relations, so on, related to health. This terminology, I think, is important to identify because people choose to refer to it in very different ways. In fact, there have been very heated debates and discussion about these two different phrases. Some people prefer using the word disabled person. In fact, in a lot of kind of neurodivergent communities and deaf and blind individuals, identity first language is more common. Under identity first language, somebody is a disabled person rather than a person with a disability. The contention or argument that people commonly make, and the reason why people prefer identity first language, is oftentimes because they view disability as a central or core part of their identity. So for example, if somebody considers themselves to be a deaf person, deafness is a central part of who that person is, right? In the same way that when we talk about race and referring to identity, you might say, I am a white woman, or I am a Black woman, right? You don't say, I am a woman with Black, because that sounds grammatically really strange, but also because it assumes that one's Blackness is external to being a woman, right? In the same way, folks argue that disability experience is felt in a strong and personal way, such that there isn't a person that exists external to that disability, but that's part of who that person is. And others prefer to use the term person with disability or refer to themselves as a person with a disability, right? The big difference here is that oftentimes people who use person-first language do so generally out of a belief or approach to disability that views disability as something that's external to who they are or something that they view more negatively, right? So for example, somebody might say that they are a person with diabetes. They don't consider themselves, like they don't consider being diabetic to be a core of who they are, and in fact might be frustrated or unhappy with that element of themselves, and therefore center themselves as the person first, right? So people oftentimes with disability that relates to illness or chronic conditions, they're viewed more negatively, use person-first language a bit more commonly, right? And I think this distinction is important to know because the best rule of thumb is to refer to somebody based on how they want to sequence or define themselves. You're a person with a disability, cool. You're a disabled person, cool, right? One of the challenges that comes in is when there is a disparity between how people are advocating or using language for themselves and how other people are referring to them or advocating on their behalf, right? For example, in a lot of neurodivergent communities, the neurodivergent person themselves will say, like, I am a disabled person, and parents or doctors or friends who attempt to advocate for them say, oh, it's a person with a disability, and that can be a source of friction, right? One of the other challenges in thinking about this is how do you communicate about it more broadly, right? If you're talking about disability in a very general sense, or you're working on public communication for something like a healthcare company, what do? Oftentimes, person-first language is more common, referring to a general population, although sometimes disabled person is used too, sometimes they're used intermittently, or sometimes it's used kind of with a bit of a note or caption explaining why that language is chosen. So it's contextual is the best way to describe that distinction. So I wanted to highlight, I mentioned in some of my research, I interviewed people who are both LGBTQ plus and autistic. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that I understood and explored through that process that I thought were a little bit interesting to look into that relate to disability as it impacts healthcare. There was one person that I interviewed who talked about the idea that because disability, such as autism, was understood as by her parents only impacting white people, the interviewee felt like that what it meant to be a disabled person of color was something that she didn't really develop until later, right? Another blogger that I included in this research was understanding the ways in which people who experience a variety of aspects of social identity in addition to disability might have some unique challenges. And some of the ways in which some assumptions about what it means to be a person with a disability, right? Look how, quote, high functioning you are, can be used too, right? The idea of a functioning label being used to say, oh, you're not really a person with a disability. In fact, in the context of disability, including neurodivergence, and more generally, oftentimes people advocating for their healthcare or needs find themselves in a bit of a double. Either somebody is considered not disabled enough to advocate on behalf of their needs. You're not really disabled. You can't really speak for this community, or you can't really advocate for your health needs here. Or people are considered too disabled to be taken seriously or understood, right? Oh, you are so impacted by this disability that you don't know what you really want. This is especially true when we think about things such as care for older patients who at times are taken less seriously in seeking out healthcare needs. Another challenge that happens in advocating healthcare and communication for folks with disabilities is the challenge of infantilization. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the term when we talked about vulnerable populations and infantilization. The idea of being treated like a child, being talked to more slowly or less complicated language, and feeling condescended to on that basis, right? One person I interviewed talked about the challenge of not feeling like they were taken seriously. Another person, when they were talking about their experiences in healthcare, said that the doctor started talking to them in a higher pitched voice. And then another person explained that when they disclosed and talked about disability at the doctor's office, that they started to feel like they were treated like a specimen or an object of fascination. Right? That can be a challenge in healthcare too. And then another challenge that I wanted to kind of highlight is this idea of compounding or overlapping experiences of disability, right? A lot of people like to joke who are immunocompromised or have autoimmune conditions that it's kind of like a fun pack, right? Where it comes in a combo. You get one free. The idea here that a lot of times autoimmune conditions, people experience multiple of those at the same time, or individuals experience multiple disabilities. A lot of times people who experience challenges in healthcare related to disabilities find that they're not able to have all of their needs met and only like one disability or element gets focused on. One person I interviewed in talking about this in healthcare described disclosing autism to a doctor as kind of like a juicy treat that meant that the doctor couldn't focus on other things. Feeling unheard, swept under the rug, not receiving care, or being told that on the basis of things like disability, there might be a lot of other causes for problems or health issues that people had, but one disability being used to explain everything is another issue in healthcare. So I wanted to highlight some of these quotations and work that kind of came up when I interviewed people on the margins, because I think that helps us to understand some of the challenges folks with disabilities have in terms of healthcare, feeling infantilized, not feeling like they receive full attention or understanding or literacy from the end of providers on some of the needs and issues that people have. As mentioned, disability is not something that is always seen, right? It can be invisible, intermittently visible, and so forth. For example, right, maybe somebody is not clearly seen as disabled until they collapse on the ground, right? So I have orthostatic hypotension, I have low blood pressure, and that means that sometimes if I transition from sitting to standing or standing to walking, I briefly lose my balance. And that's not necessarily known or seen unless it happens, right? And then suddenly it's very noticed. So oftentimes folks with disabilities find that their disability experience is not always something that other people notice or recognize or assume out of that person. In fact, sometimes people will attempt to make their disability more known or visible or active so that a doctor is more likely to take it seriously when people are trying to get care. That by appearing more disabled, that disability is actually understood and taken seriously. For example, people who are taking a medication have reported that they, before they see a doctor, stop taking the medication so that their symptoms are more visibly noticed by a doctor too, right? It's an example of more negative experiences in care, but one that people have encountered. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these articles and then give you all the chance to do some work that is applying and looking at these. I assigned for this week 3 articles from a journal called Disability Studies Quarterly that publishes a lot of pieces by, for, and about disability. And I picked some pieces that relate pretty specifically to health and science communication. The first piece that I'm having you look at for this week is from Baker, and it's called Bridging the Deficiency Divide. And again, this is going back to the medical model and the idea that there's an approach to disability that views it as a deficit. There's an ideal healthy body. Anything that's not that particular body is considered to be disabled. However, right, the more social model or model that does not view disability as a deficiency has not really been used much by healthcare providers, right? That model has not really been widely circulated or understood even though it could be important for things like patient-centered care or better understanding the needs of disability communities. So, the goal here of this article is to understand the benefits to moving away from a deficit model, what that does, and understanding how specifically people have encouraged and allowed healthcare providers to move to that model of thinking about disability. The second piece is from the Vault, and it's called Mediated Communication in Context, with focus on deaf accessibility, right? One thing to think about is that deaf populations might or might not consider themselves to be disabled. That's a category or label some people choose or actively reject. In fact, that's an important note to add, right? That disability as a label or as a category is not something that everybody necessarily identifies with. They have a chronic condition or experience. In fact, thinking about culture, including factors like race, oftentimes there are people who will explicitly have a negative association with the term disability and say, that's not me, I'm not like that, right? So barriers for deaf people in healthcare might include things like ASL interpretation, health literacy of doctors and healthcare providers, expertise among healthcare professionals, and so forth. So what this article looks at is how the social model of disability allows a better understanding of the barriers and issues that are experienced in healthcare and can better provide support for deaf people and folks with disabilities broadly. And then the last piece for this week is the Richardson et al. Piece that's about community engagement in healthcare. This one's especially cool because the entire study was done in the state of Oregon and was looking at healthcare facilities and methods of support in locations, including Pendleton. And so I thought it would be an interesting way to examine how healthcare providers and communicators are engaging with local communities to address barriers in healthcare and improve health communication. So community engagement in the state of Oregon was focused on for this project. And it actually looks at a variety of events, including town hall meetings. The idea that by engaging with members of the community, including people with disabilities themselves, that healthcare providers can engage in better, more effective, and more equitable practices in order to improve their communication and work with patients. So I think this is a useful piece as well to think about how we can listen to and support people from a variety of perspectives on these kinds of health-related issues. So those are the three articles for this week. Again, they're from that Disability Studies Quarterly journal, and all are pretty easy to access. So what I want us to do is I am going to split us in half into two different groups who will work on this for their attendance for today. And I have three different prompts for your groups to tackle that look at each of those articles. So the first one is that Baker piece about how the efficiency model is used by healthcare providers. And in looking at that article, I want you to think about how might moving away from a deficiency-based model change the way that healthcare is provided, right? So what are the differences in how healthcare might be given and so forth. And then the DuVault piece, the second article that is looking at how the social model can be useful for deaf populations. How does the social model of disability improve patient-provider communication? And then lastly, take some time to look a little bit at that Richardson article about community engagement and care and explore what methods of community engagement in Oregon have improved healthcare. It's a chance to look into some of the key ideas in each of those pieces, an opportunity for you all to work together on those. You all could work through sequentially these questions together, or maybe within your group you decide to divide up who's tackling which question. It's up to you. But I would like you to take some time to explore these questions, have the chance to write or type your responses to those, and then I'll hear from the two groups in working through that. So it looks like we have 4, 9 people here today, so we'll do a group of 4 and a group of 5. So we'll do Fran, Lee, Crew, and Izzy as a group of 4. And then Tima, Angelin, Macy, Garrett, and Justice. Oh, that's 6, isn't it? No, that's 5. Numbers. Okay. All right. So we have a group of 4, group of 5. So take some time to chat a little bit about this and work through some of these questions. I'll do a check-in in about 20 minutes or so. We can adjust, go a little bit longer or shorter on this based on how you're doing and working through this.